Okay, we'll get started. This session may be rather lengthy, but it's kind of important because much of what we cover today is going to be foundational to what you'll be doing the rest of the semester, especially when it comes to doing conducting research and incorporating that research and documenting it accurately. So I'm going to start with much as I did with the description essay. If we were in a face-to-face class, I would distribute these guidelines and then I would make some comments about different, kind of elaborate on some of the guidelines. Please don't hesitate to stop, ask me questions, raise your hand if you need any help, type questions, whatever's necessary. Again, the length is roughly the same. This is, and I need to emphasize this is not a research paper, okay? This is not a research paper. This is an essay in which you incorporate a couple of things that you find online. That's it, and you document them. It's practice, really. Each of our formal writing assignments build on the previous ones. Most of them sort of add a new element to them. They become more complex. They refine certain skills and add new ones. And so this is just adding the skill of evaluating source material that you find using a popular search engine like Google or Bing, and then incorporating it accurately and then documenting it in the paper itself and then in the references page at the end, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So, but again, this is not a research paper. The difference is this: a research paper is totally guided by what you find online. This essay you should be able to write, draft it first, and then go and find something, one or two things to pull into it. The research is not the most important part of this essay. Handling the research is important, okay, but the paper itself should not be based on research. I hope that's clear because I often have a couple of students who turn this into a full-blown research paper, and they have to go back and redo it because that's not what this is supposed to be, okay? So again, the length is still pretty short. We've still got that target of between 600 and 750 words. A little bit shorter is okay. A little bit longer is okay. A lot shorter, a lot longer, and then you're not really controlling your information, or else your topic's not going to work. The purpose, when you're comparing and contrasting, this is important too when you're choosing your subjects. The most important thing is you want to be able to write as an insider, and that means that you know enough personally about the two topics that you choose that you can write without doing any research, that you know enough detail. Now, here's the important thing. If you are looking at two subjects that are not very similar, and this is why I hate it when students kind of go online and they try and find topics by Googling something like, compare and contrast topics. And they'll come back with things like cats versus dogs and winter versus summer. Those are terrible topics, honestly, because it's very difficult to say what the reader, if you're trying to show their differences, it's very difficult to say what the reader doesn't already know. What kind of value are you going to bring to something like that by telling us what we already know, right? Now, so that's the reason if there are not a lot of similarities between your topics, you have to talk about how they're similar, because that may have value, okay? That's unexpected. That's a little bit more complicated. So I hope that makes sense. The easiest way to approach this, in my mind, is to choose two topics that are similar enough that it makes sense to show their differences. And what those two things are just depends on what you know. So, for example, if I were to write this paper, I'm a reader, so I could take two books that were written by one of my favorite authors, and I could show, their similarities and their differences, but primarily focus on their differences. Or I'm a big movie watcher, so I could take a particular actress, for example, and I could look at two movies that she's been in and that are similar and talk about her performances there. Or I could look at a book and a movie, for example, and show the distinctions between the differences between what happens in the book versus what happens in the movie. So those would be some possibilities. I also eat out a lot, so I could take 2 restaurants, but notice they need to be similar. So, for example, I could take 2 Mexican restaurants, or 2 steak houses. But what you don't want to do is to take a sit-down restaurant and show how it is different from a fast food restaurant, because again, you are telling us what we already know, and there's no value in that really. I hope that makes sense. If you there's sports related topics, if you are someone who really enjoys vehicles and works on them, or knows a lot of differences between, what you don't want to do, cars versus trucks again, if you want to show differences, because again, what are you going to say that we don't know? One can haul things and one, but something that's very similar to this year's model of Ford F-150 versus 3 years ago, and honestly, I don't know anything about trucks, so there may not even be a Ford F-150. That's a different thing because there's enough similarity. Now, there's a short video that talks about how to organize the paper, subject by subject or point by point or blended method. So I'm not going to take time here since we have so much to cover to review that. But normally those are the most common methods of organizing information. The paper should have a thesis, all right, which means there's a main point. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're recommending one of your subjects over the other. You certainly may do that, but it doesn't mean that you have to. It can just mean that, but you've got to find some point that sort of ties everything together, all right? Here's the information about writing as an insider. And again, the research is just a supplement to what you yourself, as a matter of fact, I always recommend students draft the paper first, then find your research to pull into it. Invention strategies. I believe that short video talks about using cluster diagrams. That's also known as webbing or mapping. That is a great visual way. As a matter of fact, if you'll break it down to the 3rd level, you have your subjects, and then the next level would be the different criteria that you're using to evaluate your subjects, and then after that, the examples for each criteria. So for example, I think I used in that video, if you're going to look at McDonald's versus Hardee's, then you could look at, price points would be one of the criteria, and then the bubble off of that would be specific prices, the cost of a Big Mac, the cost of a Quarter Pounder with cheese, and so forth. You could use target, I think I use target audience for, one sort of tries to sell to kids and pulls the parents in, while the other's got a totally different audience, and so forth. Invention strategy, so the cluster diagram works as does using a Venn diagram, which I'll show you in a second. Now here's the only research component to this. Find 2 reliable sources, so notice that you have to evaluate them, and there's a lesson in this week having to do with evaluating source material, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But find 2 sources, and all you have to do is pull in maybe a statistic from each, or a quotation from each, but something to help support what you said. And then to incorporate means to pull it into what you're writing, okay, to bring it in someplace in the paper, using either direct quotations, paraphrases, or both. We'll talk about what that means. And then document it using in-text citations and a references page. More on documentation in a second. References, by the way, is in the American Psychological Association formatting, which is the form that we're using. I realize most students in high school study the Modern Language Association method of documentation. That's because your English teachers are English teachers. So the discipline really kind of dictates what type of documentation format you use. For example, there are 4 kind of popular ones, but there are many more than that. The most common are either Modern MLA, the Modern Language Association, or APA, the American Psychological Association. There's also the Chicago Style Manual. So for example, if you write something that's going to be published in a newspaper or a magazine, normally they use the Chicago Style Manual. And then if you go on to not just a four-year institution, but you go on and get a graduate degree, a master's level or higher degree, often your graduate work, they use the Turabian method. So please be aware there are all types of documentation styles. It just depends on the discipline. So in English, literature especially, if you take a literature class, you will use MLA. But because Georgia Northwestern Technical College is a social sciences school, that's the reason I choose to teach APA, because most of if you intend to get an associate's degree from this campus, then APA is probably what you'll need to know. Education courses, early education uses APA, business I believe uses APA, obviously psychology and sociology, if you had to do research for those classes, use APA. I want to say history uses APA as well. So that's the reason it's more commonly used throughout any disciplines here at this college. That's what you're expected to know. So that's why I teach it. Transitions, you've got a lesson having to do with transitions and more about that, but that's one of the things I'll mention to you when I look at your drafts, okay? All right, next page. You've studied Standard American English. I've graded your diction quizzes. You had a lesson on diction. So please remember, from everything that you write for me for the remainder of the semester, you need to practice using that academic Standard American English level. That means avoid being too informal. Very rarely do I have students who write too formally, and you may recall that that elevated level, if you use it in the wrong setting, sounds pretentious. Every once in a while I have a student who sort of, I think he or she is trying to be impressive, and so they will write in a very complicated manner, really lengthy sentences with very complex terminology, and it's not really their style, A, but it also doesn't fit the assignment, B. So that's what we mean by saying something is pretentious. It's overly done, it's overblown. So we're trying to aim, more often than not, students are too informal, and a lot of that has to do with, we're in the world of texting and shorthand, BRBs and LOLs, and and so we're used to, even I realize when I'm in a classroom or even in these live sessions, I tend to speak rather informally. But when you're talking about writing at the academic level, usually you want to avoid being too casual. And that means avoiding contractions like isn't, wouldn't, couldn't, shouldn't. I mean, you can get away with one or two, but if your paper is littered with them, then that actually lowers the level of diction. You also don't want to use abbreviations. The one exception to that is if you are using an acronym, and an acronym, of course, is a common term that just uses the first letter of the length of your term. So, for example, acronym, this is the word, and you may be familiar with this, but for example, the acronym for, let's just say, ADD, right? Well, most of us know that stands for, that's an acronym, but it stands for, oh gosh, I don't remember what it stands for. Attention deficit disorder. And so the guideline for using acronyms in a paper is that the first time that it appears in the text, you need to spell it out. So if you're writing a paper and you say it's very common to find students with ADD, or with attention deficit disorder, and then in parentheses you put, immediately following it, you put the ADD, and then throughout the rest of the paper you can use ADD, okay? Otherwise, if you've got the state, Georgia, Alabama, Tuesday, don't abbreviate those, TUES, period. Spell them out. All right, we're using the same format as we did last time. So the page should look exactly like the page that was established last time. You do need a title that's relevant to your subject matter, and again, the appropriate header. Now, students ask whether or not they can use first person I on this assignment, and the answer is if it's appropriate. So, if you're, for example, if you're going to talk about the difference between Harry Potter series of books versus the movies, you don't necessarily need to put yourself in it, right? It doesn't necessarily need for you to talk about how you felt about it, because this is not a subjective paper. Most of the writing that you'll be doing this semester is going to increasingly be objective, which means even though, yes, at heart, it is based on your ideas and your interests and so forth, you don't actually put yourself in the paper. Again, that's part of elevating your writing somewhat, okay? But if it's necessary, then that would be fine. For example, I have students who write about vacations, and so one of the ways that they do that is they kind of create a frame for what they want to say. For example, say they chose 2 beaches that they visited, and so to kind of set it up in the introduction and in the conclusion by their families and what their families enjoyed doing, or which place was appropriate for family and which place was more for, as a couple or something like that, then that kind of makes sense in that context. So I'm not telling you you can't write from first person I. I'm just saying let your subject matter help dictate that for you. All right, today's your live session. The drafted essay is due next Tuesday, and it's Tuesday because Monday is a holiday, Juneteenth, and so the campus is closed, so all of your assignments will not be due until Tuesday. My feedback will again be available on, just as we did last time with your description essays, will be available after 4 o'clock. I hope to have I will have your description essays graded by at least then. The English department at Georgia Northwestern allows for 2 weeks to grade an essay. I mean, that's sort of the guideline that we have. I try and get them in sooner. It just depends on what my grading load looks like at any given time, given all the courses that I teach, and most of them are writing courses. So it takes a little bit of time. But I hope to have your final description essays graded by then, so at least you'll have that to go on as well. But my specific feedback on your papers will be available after 4 o'clock next Thursday. Again, it'll be recorded. Please remember, I don't take late drafts, so you have to, unless there's a verifiable emergency, and verifiable means that you've got paperwork. Okay, so you have to get the draft in on time. My feedback will be available then, both recorded and typed, and then the final paper will be due that following Monday. And again, we're using that same header. It should look like this. All right, I'm going to pause. Do you have any questions before we get into kind of now the research portion of this? Okay, we'll continue. I believe you have a plagiarism lesson this week. I want to say that it was this week. If it's not, it's next week. But there are a couple of things I want to point out. I don't want to read for you again what you can already read for yourself, but I want to sort of add some context as we now get into talking about documentation. Because plagiarism is the absence of correctly handling information and giving credit. And essentially, you plagiarize in 2 ways. One is by copying something word for word, and like you read a source online, and you literally just copy and paste something that he or she said, and you don't put quotation marks around it. Okay, that is a form of plagiarism, because what you're doing is you're presenting somebody else's words as though they are your own. The second form of plagiarism, which is also pretty common, unfortunately, is to include information either in the original source's words, or even if you take something you read and rewrite it in your own words, but you don't give credit to a source. You do not document it. When we're talking about documentation, we're talking about 2 things. Documentation equals in-text citation. So how in the paper you give credit, and I hope this is review for you, but I realize some students I've been out of school for a long time and haven't had to do much research, and some students never really studied this in any depth. So I have to at least review it. Documentation means how you give credit in the paper itself, how you identify which information comes from other sources or other sort of sources of knowledge versus your own. And then at the end of the paper, the bibliography. I'm going to run out of room here. Okay, so documentation means in the paper itself, and then at the very end, providing all the information that a reader would need in order to go back and actually look at that source for him or herself. Okay, so that's what we mean. Two things: in the paper itself, giving credit, and at the end of the paper, providing a complete bibliographic entry so that the reader would be able to go back and look at the same thing that you saw. All right, so if we look at this little quiz that I include in the plagiarism lesson, this I actually provided just for your information. There's a separate quiz, but this was just so that you could review and maybe get a better understanding. Again, plagiarism comes from the Latin word plagiarius, which means kidnapper. 85% of the time, based on my over 30 years of experience, when students plagiarize, they do it unintentionally. It's just that they don't really understand what they need to do to give credit, or what needs, documentation and what doesn't. So 85% of the time it's unintentional. The other 15% of the time, a student knows exactly what he or she is doing. They're submitting something else somebody else did, and they know that, but they're not giving that person credit intentionally. That's the reason, if you notice on the syllabus, I draw a distinction between unintentional plagiarism, you can't make above a 50, and intentional plagiarism, the assignment automatically fails. The good news is, though, if you get a draft in on time, I check for that, right? I sort of help you make sure that that's not going to be an issue. That's another thing, too, that Turnitin does for you. There's a similarity report in the upper right-hand corner. If it says 0, it means that when you upload your paper, none of the material matched any of the papers in the Turnitin database from college students across the country. And it also did not match sources online. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not plagiarism in the paper, because you can still write things in your own words, and if you don't, and so of course Turnitin's not going to catch it, but anything that you don't know before you read it, you've got to give credit. We'll go over more about that in a second. But Turnitin, for example, if you have a 7 in the upper right-hand corner when you submit a paper, what that's indicating is that Turnitin has matched 7% of your paper to other source material. And if you select that 7, it's usually listed on once you launch Feedback Studio, it's listed on the right-hand side. And I'll do a little explanatory video on this a little bit later. But it will actually highlight the information that it's found as a match. Okay. So in other words, Turnitin can be a teaching tool to kind of help you identify. But also, when I read through your papers, your drafts, I too will look for that and look for unintentional plagiarism and help you identify it and correct it. Okay. Now, this little example here, I've taken and copied a paragraph that comes from this book by Jon Krakauer. This is called a bibliographic entry. In APA formatting, you start with the author's, this is all the information that somebody would need to go and find where this paragraph came from. All right, so it was written by Jon Krakauer, but the name is inverted in bibliographic entries. That means that the last name comes first, then a comma, then the first initial. That's one of the odd things about APA documentation. If you're familiar with MLA, you spell out the author's names. In APA, you do not. You do not spell out their first or middle names. The second kind of odd thing in APA documentation is that the date of publication comes second, and it follows the author's name, and it's placed in parentheses. That's because APA documentation is very research-oriented. It's very research-driven. Often, for example, in the social sciences, you want to work with the latest and greatest information, and so that's the reason the date's important. What comes next then is in this case, this was a book, so this is the title of the book, italicized. Then the publication information, so that's where the book was published, then a colon, and then the publisher, comma, and then this particular paragraph was taken, it began on the bottom of page 122, and it continued to page 123. Now, the reason that I provided this in this little exercise is because that allows a student, if a student understands documentation, you can look at these samples, and that's one of the ways that you can tell if there's a problem. Because the in-text citation, what goes in the paper itself, to identify a speaker, in this case Krakauer, is based off of this. It's whatever comes first. It's the author's name and the year of publication. In APA documentation, the in-text citation, again, what appears in the text, author's last name, and year of publication. Okay, and that's called documenting your source. All right, so I've got these 6 samples here, and 4 of them would be considered plagiarized, and 1 of them would not. 2 of them would not. So the first one is considered plagiarized because it's copied word for word. All right, see there, here's that sentence right here in the original. There was a very real fear. There are no quotation marks around it, even though it's copied word for word. And by the way, the guideline is 5 or more words in the same order as the original must be placed in quotation marks, unless it's a really common phrase, okay? And sometimes that's just common sense. And there's no documentation, okay? There's no in-text citation indicating where this would come from. So to correct it, this is called a signal phrase. Anytime you have a direct quotation, I recommend that you use a signal phrase. A signal phrase is simply setting up the quotation. According to John Krakauer, or Krakauer, what I have here, and then immediately following the name, you need the date. But because you're putting the author's name as part of the text, you don't have to put it in the parentheses, okay? And by the way, you may have heard the term parenthetical citation. That means the same thing as in-text citation. They're synonymous. It's what's included in the parentheses. So Krakauer, and then 1998 in parentheses, says, there was a very real fear, the time is blah, 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 and then the page number comes at the end. Now, only if you are working with print sources, and that means you held the book, the magazine, the newspaper in your hands, do you need to include page numbers. These days, almost all research is done online. You know, there are articles that students find online, even ebooks that students find online. In the in-text citations, you do not have to include page numbers. You do not have to include paragraph numbers, okay? Number 2 is not plagiarized because this is the student writer who has kind of summarized a point. And then notice there's 6 words here that he copies, I think she copied in the same order as the original. So she put those in quotation marks to show I copied this word for word. But either way, she still documented it. Krakauer, 1998, and then the page number. So you know, it's got the documentation and it's got the quotation marks where it's needed. Now, honestly, most of the time when students unintentionally plagiarize, it's because they misunderstand. They think only direct quotations need documentation. That is not true. Again, if you read it someplace else, even if you put the information in your own words, it doesn't matter. You still have to give credit to the source for those ideas, okay? So it's not just words. It's words, sentence structures, and ideas that you got from another source. The one exception to that is what's called common knowledge. And common knowledge is a tricky term because common knowledge does not mean that we all know it. For example, John Adams, who was the 2nd president of the United States, I think, his birthday would be considered common knowledge. It's a fact. It's never going to change. excuse me, but I ask this every year in a classroom. Does anybody know when John Adams was born? Nobody does. So we do not share that common knowledge, but it's encyclopedic type information that's not going to change. And in that case, you don't need to document it. But my recommendation to students is, when in doubt, always document. All right, number 3. If I distribute this in a class, and I ask students to do this to see what they understand about plagiarism before we go over it, if they miss one, they always miss number 3, because number 3 is an example of stealing sentence structures. Now, I will be honest, when I was in school, I did not realize this was a form of plagiarism. So what I and some of my friends would do is we would copy a sentence or a passage from a text, and then we would get a thesaurus that contains a bunch of synonyms, and we would just change out a few of the words and find synonyms for them, and we thought that was fine. It's not. If you actually copy somebody's sentences, even if you change a couple of the words around, it's still considered plagiarism because you're stealing somebody's style, their structure. And so the reason that this particular passage would be considered plagiarized is because the second sentence here, for example, the existence of a Taiwanese group on Everest was a matter of serious unease to most everyone else on the mountain. What happens, these were the words that were changed out. Existence was changed, presence was changed to existence, okay? Matter of grave concern, serious unease, grave concern was changed to serious unease. And other expeditions was changed to everyone else. But everything else in that sentence was that author's style, okay? The next one contains documentation, but there's part of this that was copied word for word. I'm not going to finish this, but you get the main point, I hope, with this little exercise. Hopefully that was helpful. Do you have any questions about this before we go on? All right, let me see if I can rotate this. I don't know if I can or not. I don't think it's going to let me rotate it. Let's see. Oh, well, okay. This is called a Venn diagram. You kind of get the point here. Venn diagrams are kind of a simple but visual way of organizing information. So this is back to pre-writing exercises that you can do with your two subjects. In a comparison contrast paper, you can have one circle would be one subject, the second circle would be your second subject. In the larger space here that does not intersect, this would be like the differences between the two subjects, right? And then here in the middle is where the similarities are. So it doesn't mean that the paper, especially if you're contrasting, which means you're looking at the differences. That's probably the bulk of the paper, unless you're taking two subjects that are nothing alike and trying to show how they're similar. But that doesn't mean that you won't discuss their similarities. Normally, where you handle similarities in a largely contrasting paper is it's usually the second paragraph, honestly. Two of the most, or in the introduction, two of the most popular food chains in America are this and this, okay? They both are known for, and so it's fine to include those. As a matter of fact, you should, but the bulk of the paper should be about differences. Also notice that in a comparison contrast paper, you don't want to focus more on one subject than the other. You want to devote about equal space to each. So if you find, that's one of the values of this pre-writing exercise, but the cluster diagram and using a Venn diagram will show you if you've got enough to say. That saves you time, quite frankly, and frustration. And honestly, with the cluster diagram, if you break it down into enough levels visually, you literally can just take those and turn them into paragraphs. The paper almost writes itself. So I highly recommend using these two forms of pre-writing. Now, you don't have to turn them into me. I'm not requiring them like I did with your blog, where you did the free write and the answering the questions. And certainly feel free to use those techniques as well if they work for you. But I'm not requiring it, but I'm strongly suggesting, as someone who not only teaches writing, but has done a lot of writing personally, pre-writing honestly does save you time. All right, any questions about that before we go on and kind of get a little bit deeper into now the finding sources and documenting it part of this discussion? Okay, if not, let's get into this then. A version of this PowerPoint, I believe, is in your lesson this week. When you are looking at information online, you want to make sure that you're using information that's reliable. And it's really on you, the researcher, to verify that. I've had students quote from fifth graders' papers. I have had students quote from random people's blogs. And quite frankly, that information, if you don't do your due diligence, it's not considered reliable. So when you're evaluating, you're really looking at these areas. Is the information reliable and accurate? And one of the ways you can tell that is if you go to several sources and they kind of all say the same thing, they're reliable sources. The second way is to look at the credentials of the person or organization who's doing the talking or doing the writing. You can also examine for degree of bias. Now, this gets a little bit tricky, but you want to make sure if you want to be taken seriously as a credible source, then you want to make sure that the information that you use to build a paper, on which you use to build a paper, is not terribly biased. Or if it is, at least you're acknowledging that this, especially if you're looking at politics, which when we get into the argumentation paper, the last assignment that you will have in this course, the big research paper, you want to be sure not to build a paper totally on biased information, because what happens is that's fine if your audience totally agrees with you, right? But if he or she does not, if your reader does not, then if the goal of an argumentation paper is to get someone to agree with you, or at least consider your opinion, perhaps even change their mind, take some action, it's not going to happen, right, if the information comes from biased sources. And bias simply means leaning a certain direction and choosing what to put in and what to leave out. Currency has to do with how up-to-date the information is. That may or may not matter. It just depends on your subject. So, for example, if you want to write about current topics in the news, and that doesn't necessarily apply to this compare contrast paper, but you want to make sure that you're looking at that you're not looking at information that's 15 years old, unless you're looking at it from an historical perspective. And then finally, scope of coverage means how comprehensive, how deep is it? One of the things about online sources these days, especially using popular search engines like Google or Bing or Safari to find information, is there are lots of websites that essentially read what other websites have written, the original sources, and then summarize it, and and then put a fantastic title on it just to get, it's called clickbait, right? Just to get people to click on it when they see the title. But essentially there's no depth to the reporting or to the information. They're just using somebody else's bias. Now, we're not going to watch this YouTube video, but this was created, it goes into more depth than I have here. About it was one of the library, I think it's University Library, and it basically talks in more depth about doing this type of evaluation. Web domains, you can tell that a domain is essentially the web address where a site's found. So it's what follows the dot, okay? And this is an order of reliability. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean if you don't feel like the government's reliable. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying if it's a .gov, if it's a document or a web page that has a .gov, you know that it comes from a federal government agency, okay? No one else can use it. Those are heavily policed. .mil, you know it comes from one of the branches of the armed forces. I think we have 5 now, right? 5, 6 with Space Force. Anyway, so .mil means military, all right? So anything that ends with a .mil, you know it comes from a military source. Now, this is in descending order of reliability in terms of knowing what you're getting. A .edu does mean that whatever the document or web page is comes from an educational institution, but please realize that K through 12, kindergarten, you know, they have .edus. They're also .edus. So you want to make sure that you're looking at a higher education or research center .edu, you know, some university. Rather, that's where, you know, I've had students quote from 5th graders papers, and they would say, well, it's a .edu, but yeah, some proud teacher posted the student paper, you know, on their school website, but it was still a 5th grader. .org used to only be nonprofits, but that's not the case anymore. Now, so if it's a .org, it's not necessarily guaranteed to be reliable. Please hear me on that. A lot of students think if it's .org, it's reliable. Not necessarily. Now, it may be obvious, it may be something like the Heart Association or other famous nonprofits. You don't have to worry about that. There's no needed evaluation. But now you actually, any group can it just takes a little money to purchase a .org. Okay, so if it's an unfamiliar organization, you may have to do a little bit more digging to determine if it's biased, if it's credible, and so forth. A .com is the most common, of course. It's a commercial site. Anybody can have a .com. It just takes some money. And a .net could be anything. Now, there's some really good information on some .nets. Net stands for network. And so what that essentially means, they're groups. So for example, you may belong to one, a .net. I know especially in technology, there are a lot of .nets, and sometimes it takes a little bit of money to belong to a particular .net, but they often put out really good information. But again, you have to like be willing to go the extra mile and evaluate the source material. In a paper, when we're talking about incorporating sources, we're talking about ways to pull information into a paper, and there are 3 ways to do that. The most familiar is, of course, direct quotations. Any middle school or high schooler can tell you how to copy and paste, okay, because that's often what they know to do and how they're taught to do research, okay. Direct quotation means, of course, word for word in quotation marks with documentation. The other 2 ways, though, are to write things in your own words. And quite frankly, as you're trying to elevate your writing to make it more sophisticated, to make it more collegiate, you should rely more heavily on paraphrase and summary to pull in information, and use direct quotations intentionally and sparingly. Okay, one of the things that I recommend for your especially when we get to the larger research paper, no more than 20% of your paper should be directly quoted. And that's one of the great things that Turnitin will show you, because again, it shows you your similarity report. So as long as you're handling the information accurately, a similarity is not the same thing as plagiarism, right? As long as you're putting quotation marks around the information and documenting it, it's not plagiarized. But for my students, I set the threshold at 20%, because more than 20%, the paper becomes really choppy, right? It's just more people, other people talking. It's their voices, and you're just stringing their stuff together, all right? So I recommend to sort of a more sophisticated style. Now, please hear me. I am saying do have direct quotations. They're very important. There are just certain times that you should use them, when something's so beautifully worded that if you lose it, you know, if you try to put it in your own words, you'll lose the emphasis or meaning. When an expert is talking, when someone's presenting their side of their opinion, there are lots of times that you should directly quote, but you shouldn't only directly quote. Okay, So to paraphrase something means to write it in your own words, but it's usually close to the same length as the original. So for example, to paraphrase a 5-sentence paragraph, your paraphrase will be 5 sentences, right? So you take it almost line by line and change it up, right, and put it in your own words. A summary condenses down. It's still written in your own words, but it condenses the information down to just the gist, just the main idea, okay? But please note, whether you paraphrase, summarize, or directly quote, you have to document. Again, with an in-text citation in the paper itself, we'll look at that in a second, and then with a bibliographic entry at the end on what's called a references page in APA formatting. Unless it's considered common knowledge, and again, that's a tricky term, so always set up a direct quotation. I mentioned this before with the signal phrase, all right? So setting up who's doing the talking. Always document a direct quote, summary, or paraphrase of an online source by including in the parentheses the author's name, if one is provided. If the author's name is not provided, then you use whatever comes first in the bibliographic entry. I'll show you that in a second. And then the year of publication. And notice that, you know, you might get a complete publication date, July 4th, 1995. But in the paper itself, you do not have to put July 4th, 1995 in the parentheses, just 1995. If no date is given, and that's pretty common, when you're talking about sources you find online, you can't find a date for it, then what you put in the parentheses, you still have to have something, and what you put on the bibliographic entry is N period D period, okay, which means no date. All right, these are just a few common formats. An article on the internet, these are some of the more common bibliographic formats. I think I've also given you a section in the textbook that has a more extensive list. I've also given you links to Purdue OWL, which is their writing lab, which has an extensive list of different links about how to document using APA formatting. So here's, but just to give you some of the foremost common that you're going to find when you're doing just a general, using a general search engine. An article on the internet, okay, begins with the author's last name, comma, first initial period, then the year of publication in parentheses, next, then a period. Another odd feature to APA formatting that differs from MLA, if you're familiar with MLA, is that it doesn't capitalize all of the main words. It doesn't use quotation marks around the title of an article or the title of a web page, and it doesn't capitalize all the main words. You just capitalize the first word after a colon, and proper nouns. Okay. The second thing that, well, this is about the fourth difference. In MLA formatting, we've gone through various phases where they put the word online, or they use the word web, or they use the word accessed. In APA formatting, it's been very consistent to indicate that you found something online, and it's called your retrieval information. Retrieved, got, right? So anything you find online, unless it has a database number, and that's not going to happen with this assignment, so we'll talk about that later. But you put retrieval information, and it looks like this. Retrieved, the word retrieved, then the date you visited the site from, and then the web address, okay? So here's your complete bibliographic entry. Retrieved, and the reason that the date that you visited that website is important is because websites change. And so what you're saying, indicating to the reader, is the day I visited this site, this is what this looked like, okay? And then the web address, so that the reader could go back to look for him or herself. Now, if no author were given, then what would come? You would never start with a date. So what would come first is this title of the web page, then 2000, then the retrieval, okay? All right, if you're looking online and you find something from a particular university or department, it would look like this. author's last name, comma, first initial period, and then the date that it was published. Then here's the title of the web page. And then the retrieval information actually shouldn't be on its own line. It should be right here. Retrieved, the date from, then the web address. Okay. This is probably going to be the most common type of information you find using a popular search engine. It will have a corporate author. So National Institute, so it's not an actual person, it's an organization or a group. So that would be what comes first, then the year of publication, or then the publication date, then the title of the web page, and then again, and this is unfortunate that this is not going on the same, retrieved, and then the date from, so forth. Now, an article on the internet from a periodical is simply anything that's published regularly, whether it be daily, weekly, monthly, bi-monthly, yearly. So newspapers are periodicals, they're published daily. Magazines are periodicals, they're published either weekly or monthly usually. So you can get a print version of those, but they're also now increasingly online versions. And so notice you have your author's last name inverted, comma, first initial period, and there are two authors here, so you mentioned both of them, then the year of publication, when this was published, and then this should not be capitalized, so I need to edit this PowerPoint, obviously. Title of the title of the particular article, being a president, period, then the title of the periodical, in this case, is called the Americana, and you do capitalize all of the main words in a title of a periodical or book, and you italicize it, period, and then the retrieval information, retrieve the date from, and so forth. All right, any questions on that? All right, I've got a sample paragraph here that I want to show you. This comes from a student paper, and so I wanted to show you how the documentation, what it looks like, how it works. So this particular paragraph is taken from a write about autism, and I've learned that autism, formerly thought of as one condition, is now considered a spectrum of related distinct disorders. So this is the student writing, all right? Genetics is found to be related to only 20% of autism cases. The student paraphrased this. He wrote it in his own words, so it doesn't need quotation marks, but it does need documentation because this is a specific statistic that he found on this site. And because he did not mention the author in the paper itself, he's got to put the author's name here. So remember, two things in the paper: the author's name, if one is given, or whatever comes first in the bibliographic entry, and then the year of publication. Both things have to appear for your documentation to be complete. If there's no date, then it would be Schwartz N period D period in these parentheses, all right? In his article, so here's a signal phrase. He's setting up a direct quotation. In his article, What Really Causes Autism, Simon Makin explains, and so here's his direct quotation placed in quotation marks. He copied it word for word. And then at the end of that, now you can put the date either following the author's name or at the end, but you have to have it one of those two places, okay? But because he mentioned Makin, this author, in the text itself, he doesn't have to repeat it here. It's very clear to the reader who's doing the talking, all right? According to multiple sources, genetics cannot be determined as the main cause of autism. However, more than 4 times as many boys. So again, this is paraphrased. It's written in the student's own words, but he's got to give credit. So here's his in-text citation. I've also found that people with autism have many symptoms. And then here's another signal phrase setting up a direct quote. Here's the author. Here's the date. All right. So this is what it looks like to correctly document in the paper itself. And then notice that it's built off of this references page. First of all, you've got the 2 references that he used, and you're only using 2, right, for your paper, are alphabetized by last name. All right, so Makin comes first, and then Schwartz. And then notice that it uses what's called a hanging indentation, so that every line except for the first one is indented so that first line sticks out. That just makes it easier on the reader. Now, I realize when you only have 2 sources that the reader doesn't have trouble identifying, you know, one source over the other. So that seems less important, but references pages are set up, A, to give credit, and B, to make it easy on the reader. And for example, my master's thesis, I had 57 sources. And so my references page went on for pages. So you can see how important it is if somebody's reading my paper and wants to find more information, how important it is to have the page set up correctly, alphabetized, hanging indentation. Okay. Now, please remember, if there were no author given, then what would come first and how it would be alphabetized, if there were no author provided, would be what really causes autism, then the date, then the rest of this, and then this article would be second, because what, W follows S. Okay. All right, so very quickly, and I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. I'm going to show you, let's say I'm going to write a paper comparing, I'm going to contrast Hardee's and McDonald's. So let's just go back to my basic example. Give me a second here to get show up online. And I've got to pull in two pieces of research. Okay, so here is the McDonald's corporate site. Let's just say I want to talk about the nutrition, how one burger is maybe better than another, like is healthier, let's say, than another. So that's what I'm going to do research on, and all I'm going to pull in is some nutrition information about two of the different, one from Hardee's and one from McDonald's. So let me show you how to go about this. You know, I went to the mcdonalds.com, so there's the corporate website. Notice that there's no author on this page whatsoever. All right, there's no one person talking. But one of the good things, if you scroll to the bottom, this is usually where you can find a date. If something is, you know, when it's copyrighted, you go with the last date, so 2022. So that's going to be my date of publication. This has been updated this year. And let's see, I want, under our menu, I'm going to go to, notice how visual it is. It's very visual. Let's just say I want to find the nutrition information on a Big Mac. Okay, I find out it's 550 calories. It's giving me the ingredients. Oh, look, nutrition information. And here's the summary. And let's say I'm looking at grams of fat. So it's got 11 grams of saturated fat. Let's just say I'm going to pull that one statistic into my paper. Okay. So a McDonald's Big Mac contains 11 grams of saturated fat. That's what I'm going to say. So how do I build a bibliographic entry? Well, again, there's no one person talking. I have a corporate author. And so what I'll need to do is this. I'm going to have to use McDonald's, period. That's my corporation. And then second, I'm going to put the date in parentheses. So we're going to go with 2022, right? Here at the bottom, okay? But I have to give more information than that so that the reader knows where I got this from on this website, because there's all kinds of information here. So what I'm going to do next is, after the date and then the period, is our menu, period, Big Mac, period. And that's enough for the reader to go through and find, you know, the rest of the information, although I could put nutrition information after that, like Big Mac : nutrition information, period. Then I'm going to put retrieved, and then today's date, which would be, spell it out, so it would be June 16, 2022 from, and then all I have to do is copy and paste this web address up here, you know, highlight it and then do a Control-C or a right click and copy, and then copy that and then paste that. And so that way, in that way, I have got my bibliographic entry to incorporate that one piece of information, okay? and remember, I'm only required to use 2 sources, 2 pieces of information, so that's one of them, and I can do the same thing with Hardee's. Now, in the paper itself, when I pull in that, that particular fat gram information, I have to document it, so in the parentheses following, if I say, okay, and it's got blah, 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 11 grams of saturated fat, then I'll have the parentheses, and I put whatever comes first. In this case, it'll be McDonald's, and then I put the date, 2022. And that's all the information I need in those parentheses following that one fact that I'm bringing in to send the reader then to the references page that has the rest of that McDonald's entry. All right. I hope that helps. I hope that made sense. I'm going to pause. Do you have any questions for me about any of this, the assignment or anything else in the lessons or in the course at this point? Okay, don't hesitate to email me if questions do come up. This draft is due next Tuesday night, and I hope you have a good holiday, long weekend. And that's all I'm going to share with you for today.